right. Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this morning's session on one-time community grants at the Winnipeg Foundation. My name is Megan Tate, and I'm Vice President of Community Grants here at the Foundation. Just wanted to share that we've recently had some feedback about how we can make our presentations more accessible for those with a vision impairment. And one of the things that they shared with us is that it's helpful to describe what people are seeing on the screen. So I just want to share that this first slide is a diverse group of people connected to the Winnipeg Foundation holding a sign of their favorite cause. And so these folks you see on the screen represent some of our community partners, our donors, and others in community connected to the Winnipeg Foundation. And I want to highlight on the far right, you'll see Doris Coop. Doris is with the Vision Impaired Resource Network. And so we're really grateful to Doris for the feedback that she's given to us on how to make our presentations more accessible. So I'm going to start with a few housekeeping notes. You might have heard right off the top that this session is being recorded for those who weren't able to make it today. It will be posted on the Foundation's website at a future date. So if you missed something and you want to go back and review it later, it will be available on our website. Everyone in the session is going to be muted just to avoid background noise. So if you do have any questions throughout the presentations, we encourage you to use the chat feature. We've left time at the end of the presentation, and a member of the Winnipeg Foundation's team will read out all the questions that we've received, and we'll try to answer as many as we can in the time allotted. If you do have a question that's really more specific to your organization's unique circumstances, we encourage you to follow up directly with a member of the grants team after the presentation. So the very first thing I want to do is acknowledge that we are gathered here today on Treaty 1 territory. I'm speaking to you today from the original lands of the Anishinaabe, the Cree, the Ojai Cree, and Dene peoples, as well as the homeland of the Métis Nation. In this month, when Canadians recognize the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, I encourage all of you to reflect on the land where you are today. So a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about today. First, we're going to share a little bit about the Winnipeg Foundation. We're going to give a really brief overview of the Foundation's current strategic plan, which covers the years 2023 to 2027. We'll give you a little bit of information about what grants at the Winnipeg Foundation are going to look like in the coming year. And finally, the main event, talk in more detail about one-time community grants. This includes information about both the application and the review process. And finally, as I mentioned, we'll have time at the end to answer some questions. The first order of business is to introduce the grants team. So although we're not in a room together today, thought it would be helpful for you to see who all makes up the grants team. So that's me on the left, Vice President of Community Grants. Next on the screen is Kayla Dauphiné. Many of you might have received an email from Kayla. She's responsible for many of our grant payments, so a good person to know. Dana Kremsky, also part of our grants administrative team. Dana is our expert in Smart Simple, our new grants management system, and so she's a great resource both for us at the Winnipeg Foundation as well as for you as potential grant applicants. Andrea Zimmer is our Senior Grants Administration Specialist, and she has some oversight of our administrative and granting processes. On the next slide, you'll see our grant review staff along with their respective portfolios. So in the upper left-hand corner is Neneth Banyas. Her portfolio is community service, so that includes a full range of community projects, everything from community organizations that are dealing with housing and homelessness, newcomers and immigration, families, and much more. In the middle of the screen is Carrie Ryan. Carrie has two portfolios here at the Winnipeg Foundation. First is environment, and second is education, literacy, and employment. In the upper right-hand corner is Noah Ehrenberg. His portfolio covers health and wellness. In the bottom left-hand corner is Aaliyah Mrochak, and her portfolio includes children and youth. And so she works on many projects that support children's and youth programming, as well as some of our special granting programs. And last but not least, on the bottom right-hand side is Joanna Turner, our grants associate whose portfolio covers arts, culture, and heritage. Rounding out the team is Mercy Oluwafemi. She's our youth engagement specialist and coordinates all of our youth engagement programs. In the middle is Anna Maria Pazzi. She's a grants program specialist and has a range of duties supporting both us on the grants team and again, supporting external community organizations. If you send an email with a question to the grants at email address, Anna Maria is the friendly voice or on the other end of that keyboard. And finally, Roxanne Tacky is our learning and community engagement specialist. Roxanne does a lot of work around collecting those final reports that you all submit, turning those around and making sure that information makes its way back to our donors. So that is your friendly neighborhood grants team at the Winnipeg Foundation. So a little bit about us. We are always so proud to say that we were Canada's very first community foundation. We were built from people from all walks of life to support charitable work in our community. We were established in 1921, so a few years ago, we were able to celebrate our centennial as a community organization. Thanks to the pandemic, we weren't able to celebrate quite how we'd hoped, but still, again, really proud to say that we're Canada's very first community foundation. Today, there are over 200 community foundations from coast to coast to coast, including 57 right here in Manitoba. And I do want to share our vision, which is a Winnipeg where community life flourishes for all. And so what makes us a community foundation is our donors, donors from all walks of life who make gifts to the Winnipeg Foundation to establish permanent endowment funds. So today, the foundation is a collection of over 4,000 different funds established over the last 102 years. Each fund has its own trust conditions as determined by the donor, and it's our job to ensure that the donor's wishes are fulfilled and respected. Those endowed funds are pooled and invested, and each year we grant a portion of the income earned back to community organizations like yours. The donor that you see on the screen today is Miriam Bergen, and I just wanted to highlight that you may have heard in November about the incredible gift that Miriam has made to our community. This gift, valued at $500 million, came in the form of shares in her company. And so eventually this gift will increase our granting back to community. But as you can imagine, this is a fairly complex gift. And so it's going to take some time for us to be able to sort out all of the details. We do anticipate it'll be about a year before we start to see the impact of her gift. But in the meantime, I wanted to acknowledge Ms. Bergen's incredible generosity and her incredible gift to our community. The other thing that's helpful to share with you, just to put your application into a little bit of context, is this slide here. It represents the foundation's total granting in 2022. And so we granted $85 million to over 1,100 charities. However, this figure represents all of the grant payments that gets dispersed into community, and it goes out in a number of different ways. And so I just want to bring your attention to the third bar on this chart. It's kind of an orangey, yellowy color, and that represents our responsive grants. And when we talk about responsive grants, those are the grants that are awarded in response to applications from community organizations like yours. So you can see that of the $85 million that the foundation granted last year, just shy of 15 was actually as part of our responsive grant programs, representing about 17% of our total grant making last year. Some of the other categories to highlight is at the top, agency and designated grants. And so those come from our agency and designated funds. Designated funds were established by donors who've identified the specific charity that they want to benefit from their generosity in perpetuity. And agency funds are permanent endowment funds established by community organizations, and the income goes back to those organizations to be used at their discretion. The second chart there represents our donor-advised grants. Donor-advised funds are our fastest growing fund type at the Winnipeg Foundation. That's where donors take an active role every year in determining where their grant dollars are going to go. We work really closely with our donor engagement team, and more donor advisors are choosing to come in and support projects in our responsive grants program, which is really exciting to see. And you'll see down the rest of the list some other grant types that the foundation's responsible for. Endow Manitoba refers to our support of the network of community foundations across Manitoba. At the bottom, you'll see leadership projects. That includes things like our youth engagement programs, our agency matching program, as well as strategic grants that align with the Winnipeg Foundation strategic plan. And finally, at the bottom, you'll see scholarship funds. The Winnipeg Foundation does administer many scholarship funds that provide student awards to students in our community. So at the beginning of the year, the foundation released 2 reports to community. The first was the findings from our second vital signs report, as well as our next strategic plan, I guess current strategic plan now. Vital signs looked at community well-being and is a snapshot of Winnipeg, our strengths, our challenges, and our opportunities for the future. As you can imagine, much of this was filtered through the lens of the pandemic. And I should note that vital signs did also help inform our strategic plan. I'd encourage you to check out both documents, which are available on our website, but thought I'd just share a couple of key highlights that would be of most interest to you today. So first, I do want to reiterate that the Winnipeg Foundation remains committed to being what we call a 360-degree funder. And so that means that the Winnipeg Foundation supports the full range of community projects in our community, everything from arts and culture to community service, health and education. We're committed to continuing to fund the full range of projects in our community, along with environment and programs for children, youth, and families. So we're always going to have a role to respond to both the current and the emerging needs of our community. That said, we've identified 2 areas where we would like to increase our focus and have a deeper impact as a foundation. So the first, we've identified improving the well-being of people living in the CARE area. And CARE is short for Community Area for Revitalization and Equity. And that's the area in and around the corner of Main Street and Higgins, if you can imagine that. So home to organizations like Thunderbird House, the Aboriginal Center, Main Street Project, and many others. And so that's been one area identified as a priority for the foundation, improving the well-being of those who call that community home. Our second priority is to reduce the number of children engaged in Manitoba's child welfare system, as well as supporting young people who are aging out of that system. So those are 2 champion strategic priorities for the Winnipeg Foundation. We've also identified addressing some of the key priorities that emerge from vital signs, and that includes addressing the need for mental health and addiction services, the need for better access to affordable food and affordable and safe housing, and ways to feel a sense of belonging and inclusion, especially after the challenges of the last few years when so many of us were required to be isolated. A few other highlights from the strategic plan include the Foundation's continued commitment to truth and reconciliation. In addition, we've identified diversity, equity, and inclusion as separate but complementary foundation of our work. So again, encourage you to check out both documents for more detail on those areas, but just wanted to highlight those for you today. Looking ahead to 2024, so before we talk about the upcoming intake of one-time community grants, wanted to give you a little bit more information about what some of our responsive grant intakes are going to look like in 2024. So we are committed to hosting another intake of community grants, which, as you'll learn, is our largest and most diverse grant program. And in later slides, I'll share the full range of projects that are eligible for funding through this grant program. As I've noted, we do remain committed to being a 360-degree funder. However, we will look for opportunities through community grants for organizations to highlight how their work aligns with some of the foundation's priorities in our strategic plan. So those applications will be due in March with a notification of decision in June. In the fall, we hope to launch, we plan to host an intake of multi-year grants. So for those of you who've been around for a while, you'll remember that in 2017 and 2018, we piloted multi-year funding with plans to reintroduce the program again in 2020 based on what we learned and feedback from community organizations. Unfortunately, COVID had other plans. And so during that time, we pivoted our grant making to be able to provide COVID relief to community organizations. But we are now excited to be able to offer this opportunity again. We'll have a lot more details to share in early 2024 when we release the full calendar of intakes for the year, but just wanted to give you a little bit of a sneak peek of what we're thinking 2024 is going to look like in terms of grant making. All right, the main event, community grants. So I do want to share that the funding that is available for community grants comes from endowment funds created by donors from all walks of life. Most of these funds have been left to the discretion of the foundation, and we call those our community funds. Sometimes donors might identify a particular field of interest, like art or children, and it's our job to match those fields of interest funds up with projects as well. And finally, as I mentioned, increasingly we're seeing donor advisors who also choose to support some of the applications we receive through one-time community grants. And so that's what makes up the budget for our community grants program. So a little bit of an overview. Community grants are typically short-term. They support projects for a specific period of time, typically 1 year, although of course that varies depending on the nature of the project. Requests can be up to $100,000. However, for the past few intakes, our average grant has typically ranged between $25,000 and $40,000. So certainly keep that in mind when considering how much to request from the Winnipeg Foundation. I should note that you can apply for subsequent years of support for a project that has already been supported with a community grant. One-time grants is just the name that we use to identify that this program does not provide ongoing annual or operational support for projects. I should also note that the community grants program funds a diverse range of projects that are eligible, and I'll give you a more detailed list a little bit later. Applications are due on October 3rd at 4:30. I should note that our offices will be closed on Monday, October 2nd, in lieu of the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation. So please make a note of that as well. A few more eligibility criteria. Organizations may apply once per calendar year to the community grants program. So if you did apply in March 2023 and have already received a grant this year, you won't be eligible to apply for a community grant in our fall intake. We do make an exception for collaborative projects, and I'll also cover that in more detail later in the presentation. And finally, do want to note that post-COVID, we have reinstated the requirement that organizations submit their final report for any outstanding one-time community grants prior to submitting a new application. So a little bit of our role as a project funder. So our responsive grants do support a range of projects on a time-limited basis. We do know that community organizations need stable, ongoing operating support, which is increasingly rare. And unfortunately, our project funder model cannot meet this need, but the trade-off is that we're able to be flexible, support innovative ideas, and respond to changing community needs. We particularly saw this during the pandemic when the foundation was able to very quickly divert our funding to what was needed in the moment for community. That's the kind of flexibility that our model does provide. Again, you'll see that 360-degree funder pop up all the time. And finally, again, a note that grants are awarded for a specific purpose and for a specific period of time. So on the screen, you'll see a list of the type of one-time community projects that are eligible. So this can include capital and renovations, everything from replacing the flooring, doing cosmetic grades, both inside your building, outside your building would all be eligible. We can provide grants to support conferences and events, such as performances, festivals, anniversary celebrations, special exhibitions. I should note here that we don't fund annual fundraising events, but any other event that you can imagine would be eligible for a community grant. We also provide grants to support the purchase of equipment and infrastructure. This can be things like computers, printers, servers, specialized equipment that you need to run your programs. It can also include things like upgrades to your website or to your publications. All of those would be eligible for a one-time community grant. When you are submitting for purchases, it's helpful if you provide quotes for the items that you wish to purchase. And it's also just helpful for us to know if your request is to replace items. It's just helpful for us to know how old the items are that you're replacing. Another category of funding is for program operating. This is the cost to run a specific program, typically a pilot program or a demonstration project. This can include staffing and other program costs. We will also accept a portion of your request to include administrative costs. Typically, our guideline is between 10 and 15% of the overall project budget. And so just again, a note that we do consider administrative expenses as part of your request. Reports and planning. So many organizations are undertaking strategic planning, fundraising planning, communications planning, that kind of thing. And so grants to support that work would be eligible. We do also support capital campaigns. I should note that often capital campaigns are a better fit for our major capital grants program, but there might be some preparatory work that you need to launch a capital campaign, and that support would be eligible for a one-time community grant. Under special circumstances, the Winnipeg Foundation will consider grant requests for bridge funding. We just ask that you speak to a member of our team before submitting an application for short-term or interim operating support. And finally, organizational development and capacity building. This can include work to develop your board, again, strategic planning. It might include a specific evaluation that you want to do for one of your programs or from your organizations, that kind of thing. And finally, not listed on the slide, but I should note that we recognize that many community organizations are in fact still feeling the impacts of the pandemic. And so if that is your organization's circumstances, our community grants program is the best avenue to request funding to help with some of the COVID-related needs that your organization is facing. Slightly shorter list of things that we don't support and that are not eligible for a community grant. We do not make grants to individuals. We don't support project costs incurred before the grant decision date. So please, we always post when you can expect a decision on your application. So be mindful of that when you're planning your project and your project timelines. We don't support fundraising campaigns, fundraising events, or fundraising staff positions at this time. We don't fund paying down mortgages or reducing deficits. We don't fund political activities. We don't fund what we describe as exclusively religious activities, although certainly we acknowledge that there's many faith organizations doing good work in our community, and those projects would be eligible, just not the direct religious activity. And finally, we don't provide grants to support other grant-making programs. Sometimes in the past, we've received applications from community organizations who want to run a grant program, and they've requested funds from the Winnipeg Foundation to support that work, and that's also not eligible for a community grant. So in the next section, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we look for in a grant application. So first, eligibility. Organizations must have a registered charity number to access the grant application form. So to be eligible for a community grant, or really any grant from the Winnipeg Foundation, your organization must be a registered charity or a qualified donee. If you're a registered charity, you can log onto our system, create an account, and get started. If your organization is a qualified donee, we ask that you contact a member of our staff, and they will help you get established with your profile in the system. I should note, if you're a qualified donee, one of the things that we'll be looking for before we get you set up and you're in the system is a letter from CRA indicating your qualified donee status. In addition, to be eligible for a community grant, projects must primarily benefit the people of Winnipeg. If your organization or your project is located outside the city, you will need to make a case for how your project also benefits the people of Winnipeg. An example I always share when doing these presentations is summer camp. So certainly we provide grants to summer camps, recognizing that a large portion of Winnipeg kids attend camp outside of the city. As I mentioned, another eligibility criteria is satisfactory reporting on previous community grants. We'd really love it if you were able to submit that final report 30 days prior to the application date, but I recognize that we're less than 30 days out for the next application. I should say, if you're unsure if you have any outstanding final reports, you can always connect with the Winnipeg Foundation directly. And finally, grants are not made retroactively. So grants received in this intake will be decided on in early February, and the grants committee will not consider costs incurred prior to their meeting and making their decision. So when assessing a grant application, there's actually two things we look at. We look at the organization, and then we look at the project. So some of the things that we're looking for under organizational considerations. So first, and this is actually a new addition to our grant application form, we're asking organizations to affirm that their practices adhere to Manitoba's Human Rights Code. That's always been part of our grant criteria, but it is now actually a check that we ask you to click as part of the grant application form. Other things that we look at when it comes to an organization is your previous track record. So if your organization has received grants from the foundation in the past, we'll look at kind of what happened with those projects. If your organization is new to the foundation, there's an opportunity to describe some examples of the successes maybe you've previously had as an organization. Grant history for an organization is also considered, as well as an organization's capacity to contribute to a project. And this could either be cash or in kind. And finally, site visits. Typically, a grants associate or a member of our staff will conduct a site visit when they need a bit more information about your project. Site visits or calls or Teams meetings or Zoom meetings, however we do it these days, is a chance for us to get to know your organization better and to learn a little bit more about your project, collect information for our grants committee to help them make their decision. But I should note that having a meeting does not necessarily mean that your application will be approved. It's just another way that the grants team gathers information that we think will be helpful for the grants committee in making their decision. Some of the project considerations that we use in our assessment, first is clarity. So has this project been well thought out? Have you clearly articulated the goals and the planned activities for this project? We're looking to know what the benefit is to the community. This could include either the breadth or the depth of the project. Will it impact individuals, families, communities, your neighborhood? But the benefit back to community is one of the things we look at as part of the assessment. We also look at the needs of the population being served. So some examples of evidence of need for a project that could support the answer to that question could include statistics about your community or the community that you're serving with your project, could include community surveys or needs assessments that you might have done, anything that demonstrates kind of the need for the project that you're proposing. We are also looking for alignment between the project and your organization's mission. So how does this project fit with your organization's vision and mission? And if for some reason it does represent a shift away from your organization's primary mandate, we'll be looking for you to provide some explanation about how this new direction fits with your organization's overall goals. And finally, another project consideration is this project receiving support from other funders or other organizations? Additional project considerations that we look at include the qualifications of the staff, or in some cases, the volunteers who will be delivering the project. Do they have the expertise required to take this project on? Of course, it varies depending on the nature of the project. We're also looking if you've engaged in any consultation prior to launching the project, or if you're collaborating with other community organizations or other community partners. We do also look to see that you have a realistic budget, and looking to see if the project could go ahead if for whatever reason you don't receive the full amount that you've requested from the foundation. And finally, as part of our research, we may contact other funders or groups that you work with to learn more about your organization. We do also keep our eye on what might be said about your organization in both traditional and social media. So there's a full range of things that we look at when reviewing your project. Some other considerations, in particular for large projects, we're looking to see that you're able to identify other funding partners. The potential for other funders to come to the table is an indicator of the viability of your project, particularly when granting budgets are tight and a partial award might be contemplated. If you're working with diverse populations as part of your project, we expect that you'll demonstrate cultural competency. So this is intended to show an organization's authentic engagement with the community that it serves, and as part of our desire to ensure that we're supporting projects that create safe and supportive spaces for everyone. And finally, if you're applying specifically for a construction or a renovation project, has accessibility been considered as part of that project plan? As I've mentioned, we're a 360-degree funder, so we're not necessarily an expert in any one field, but we do look to ensure that organizations adhere to whatever the effective practices are that are followed by their sector. So if you're an early childhood education center, we're expecting that you are following the effective practices laid out by your sector. If you're engaging in counseling, or if you're working with youth, again, really expecting that you're adhering to the effective practices followed by your sector. We also do look to see what a project's impact on the environment might be, both positively and negatively. So over the years, we've certainly supported renovations or retrofits to make organizations more climate friendly. We've supported projects for people who want to transition away from disposable items and get more permanent items, that kind of thing. If you're looking to seek new computers, what's the plan for disposing of the old ones? So again, a project's impact on the environment is considered. And finally, you'll see this pop up in our grant policies and guidelines, is that grants are not made for projects that are primary responsibility of the municipal, provincial, or federal government. And sometimes we get asked by what we mean by this. And so some examples are, it'd be very unlikely that the Winnipeg Foundation, for example, would fund a teaching position in a school or a nurse position in a hospital. So things that are clearly the responsibility of government. So I've mentioned collaboration, and I want to be really clear about what we mean by collaboration. So our definition of a collaboration is 2 or more registered charities, or a registered charity and a nonprofit organization, who are jointly planning and implementing a project. And I should note that for-profit businesses are not considered collaborative partners for this definition. And it's really important that all collaborative partners are working towards a common goal to increase either organizational or program efficiency, or to tackle a community issue. And so I'd mentioned earlier that organizations can apply once per calendar year. We do make an exception for organizations who want to put forward a collaborative application. So you have an opportunity to apply for both your own organization's project as well as a collaborative project. If you are submitting a collaborative project, please make it really clear in the project summary that it is a collaboration, and identify who your collaborative partner or partners. You will also need to include additional attachments as part of your application. So either a letter or an MOU signed by all of the collaborators. I'm having problems with that word today. That's signed by all of the collaborators. And those documents should clearly outline the role and responsibilities of each partner, as well as their contributions and their investment in the project. I will note that if you are submitting both your own project and a collaborative project at the same time, that those projects will be in competition with each other. So just some general information about our intake. So you'll see this a few places, but all applications are due by 4:30 p.m. on the grant application due date. Our grant application system closes promptly at 4:30, and once the application closes, you'll not be able to submit your application. And one of the reasons that we've set the application due date time during office hours is to make sure that our staff is available to help you if you run into any technical issues. So we really do encourage you to start and complete your application before the due date and before that 4:30 p.m. cutoff. It's also important to know that you may apply for a community grant and one of our special program grants in the same calendar year, but it should be for a different project. Again, make sure that you've submitted all your outstanding final reports before sending in your application. And just note that applying for a community grant is a competitive process, and it is becoming more competitive as we're seeing both the number of applications and the amount being requested by the Winnipeg Foundation increasing over the years. And on the next slide, I'll give you a little bit more detail about some of the trends that we're seeing with our applications. So as I mentioned, we are seeing more requests and larger requests at a time when our granting budget is fairly stable. That said, every intake is different and we don't know what to expect in the upcoming intake. But it's helpful to have a little bit of statistics just to kind of place your project or your application into a little bit of context. So for our most recent intake, which was in the spring, more than 50% of our grants applications requested $50,000 or more. So again, over half of the applications were at the higher end of what they're eligible to apply for. And 17% of all of the applications requested the maximum amount of $100,000. Of those, very few received the full amount that they requested. And we definitely understand the reason why both the number of applications and the amount being requested is increasing. You're facing increased costs as organizations. Many of you are seeing increased need from your community, and the funding landscape is constantly changing. So just want to acknowledge some of the challenges that you're facing with funding. And so our grants committee does try their best to be able to provide a meaningful support for as many projects as they can. But the reality is that many projects are not able to receive the full amount that they've requested. And just want to note that in our last intake, about 16% of applications were declined. So it is difficult to predict what we're going to see in this intake. And so I'm just providing, again, this information for a little bit more context. So over the last year, as we saw this increase in applications from community, we used all of our usual criteria for assessing applications, but our grants committee did put some additional lenses on their review process. So over the past few intakes, the grants committee has chosen to prioritize applications that were time sensitive. So that's where there was a strong sense of urgency, either because of a community or an organizational need. Think of projects that address food security, for example. They also prioritized projects that address the safety of the staff at your organization or the public. Many of these requests were specific to capital upgrades. Think asbestos remediation in an early childhood education center as an area that was of high priority given the safety. And finally, falling into the theme of the organization's priority for diversity, equity, and inclusion, organizations led by the BIPOC community were prioritized because we know from recent research that those organizations tend to be dramatically underfunded compared to their peers. So that's a little bit look back at some additional lenses that the grants committee applied to the grants that we had under review. Again, we never know what we're going to get in any given intake, so we'll wait to see what we receive on October 3rd, and we'll do our best to report back to you some of the trends that we're seeing. One other note in terms of what projects might receive priority are also projects that were of interest to donor advisors. And so that's another opportunity for community organizations. Some tips specifically for new applicants. If this is your first time applying to the Winnipeg Foundation, feel free to reach out. We're always happy to answer your questions, walk you through the process, and support you in your application process. I will note that first grants are typically fairly modest. It would be highly unusual for a first-time applicant to receive the maximum $100,000 grant. First grants are an opportunity for us to build a relationship with your organization and for you to build a relationship with the Winnipeg Foundation. If you haven't already, really encourage you, again, to set up your account in our grants management system. So a bit about the application and review process. So what you see here on the screen is kind of what the landing page of the Winnipeg Foundation's grant portal. So if you've applied to the Winnipeg Foundation in the last few years, you'll be familiar with this. Again, if you're a new applicant, we'd encourage you to, as soon as possible, set up your organization's profile in the portal. Our website does include a series of tutorials that helps you with some of that work. If you've become, some of the features of this portal are that you can save applications, you can go back and look at applications that you've submitted. The portal also invites you, this is the mechanism that you'll use to submit your final reports. So it will ultimately be kind of your one-stop shop for all of your granting relationships with the Winnipeg Foundation. This is where you'll also access the grant application form. So you'll see kind of on the right-hand side, kind of in the dirt under the plant there, open funding opportunities. And when you click on that, that spot, you will be taken to our one-time grant application form. As part of your organizational profile, we do ask that you keep this section up to date. The good news is you don't have to apply your board of directors and all those attachments to every application, but we do ask that you keep your profile up to date. Some of the things that we would expect to see in this section include your most current list of board of directors, your most recent audited statements, your annual operating budget, your annual report, if there's one available. So again, you don't have to do that every time that you submit an application to the foundation, but we want to make sure that we've got the most current information on file. And I do also want to note that once a year, you will be asked to certify your organizational profile. And so if it's been a year since you've last done that, the system won't let you submit your application until you've done that certification. And so again, really encourage you to do that work as soon as you're able, because the last thing we want to see is you go to hit submit that application at 4:29 p.m. and the system doesn't let you because there's missing that step. And so on the screen, you'll see that certification highlighted. So a little bit about the application form itself. We ask you to name your project. Usually just a few words are good to name your project. We also want to know how much you're requesting from the Winnipeg Foundation specifically for this project. Again, the maximum you can request for this intake is $100,000. We're also looking for a project summary. And it's really important to try to keep this to 1 to 2 sentences. And I recognize sometimes it's harder to write short than it is to write long, but this is really the snapshot of your project. It's the first introduction to your project. Sometimes it's what we will share with donors or a grants committee as an introduction to your proposal. We're also looking for you to select the project type that best describes your project, including, so whether it's capital renovations, an event, program operating, that kind of thing. Some of the things that you don't see on this screen include, we're also looking for the start and end dates of your project. So our first question, sort of the longer narrative part of the application, we're asking you to describe the community that your project will serve. And so this is where we're looking for you to include any information on how your organization is qualified to work with or provide service to this community. So again, if you're offering a counseling program, what are the qualifications of the people who will be delivering that counseling? If you're providing counseling to diverse cultures, how are you accommodating that for that in your programming? So this is an opportunity to answer those questions. We also want to know just how you're going to implement your project. So we've got a couple of questions related to that. So we're looking for kind of the steps you're going to take. What are the specific activities that you're going to do? What are those project timelines? Those just to help us kind of understand what it is you're hoping to achieve. We want you to describe the involvement of the community that's served, as well as other community partners who took part in both the development and or the implementation of your project. And again, we're looking for you to describe the applicable skills or knowledge, expertise of the staff or the volunteers who will be engaged in the implementation of this project. And this will look very different depending on the nature of your organization and the nature of the program that or project that you're proposing. We also want to know why this project is needed at this time. So this is an opportunity to speak to the evidence of need as well as the timeliness of your project. And finally, we're looking for outcomes. So you can list 1 to 3 outcomes for this project, identifying how you're going to measure and report back to us on each of those outcomes. Of course, like every grant application, you're required to complete a budget. This budget form, I will acknowledge, is not the best. We are working on improving it, but in the meantime, it's kind of the best that we've got. It is embedded right in the grant application form, and like all budgets, we want to know how much you're requesting from the Winnipeg Foundation, and then we've broken down your revenue by other categories, whether it's government grants, other grants from either private foundations, other foundations, as well as individual donors. So we do ask you to complete that form. Complete the budget form. And finally, we're looking for supporting documents. So the grant application does allow for attachments. So some of the supporting documents specific to your application, again, there's another place to put your organizational documents. So supporting documents specific to this application could include quotes for renovations or capital purchases, that letter or that MOU from your collaborative partners. If you are a school who's applying, we want some indication that the school division is aware of the application that you're submitting. Other optional attachments could include a cover letter that just allows you to introduce the project in a little bit of a different way, and any relevant letters of support. So you might not have a formal collaborative partner for your project, but there might be a community partner or an individual in your community who could write a letter of support for your project. I will note here, sometimes we see in our applications kind of generic letters of support from maybe a city councilor, an MLA, or an MP. I will share that those aren't as strong as specific letters of support from some of your community stakeholders. So if you don't have letters of support from your city councilor or your MLA, it's probably not necessary to secure those. Again, those letters of support from key community stakeholders are more valuable. And then when you are identifying letters of support, 3 to 5 of the best letters kind of representing that support from diverse stakeholders is probably all that you need. You don't necessarily need to overwhelm us with attachments. All right, You've gone through all the questions, you've uploaded all your attachments, you've made sure that your organizational profile is all up to date. So when your application is complete, make sure that you've taken one last look at it. The system also does allow you to print a copy, but it's also important to know that all submitted applications will be saved in your organizational profile. There's a submit button that you'll click, and you will know that you've successfully submitted your application because it will now appear under My Applications Submitted. The system will generate automatic correspondence to confirm your submission. And at this time, we'd also really encourage you to delete any old drafts, just so that your profile isn't cluttered up with information and old drafts that didn't get submitted. So just some general tips about applying for a grant application to the Winnipeg Foundation. Be concise, clear, and concrete. Try to avoid jargon and acronyms. Again, we're generalists, and we know that for many sectors, you have language or acronyms that are really specific to your field. So encourage you to use more lay people's terms, as well as spell out any acronyms. And of course, always take an opportunity to proofread your application before you submit it. Final note about application deadlines. So the application portal does close at 4:30 p.m. As I've said, any in-progress applications can't be submitted after the portal closes. And it can take a few minutes for an application to be submitted. So it all depends on, what's the time on your computer? How quick is your, I was going to say modem speed. That is not very 2023 of me, but it depends how fast your computer is, how good your internet connection is, all of that. So again, really encourage you to submit well in advance of 4:30 to ensure that your application does go through. And finally, the review process. There will be a member of the grants team assigned to your file. They're the person who will do the initial review of the application. They'll highlight or anticipate any questions that our grants committee might have. If something's not clear or we need a little bit more information, there's an opportunity for them to follow up with you. At the end of the day, it is our grants committee who does review and make the final decisions on all grant applications. And our grants committee is comprised both of members of the Foundation's board of directors, as well as members of our community. So after the grant decision, if you're successful, you will receive through the portal confirmation of your grant. If a donor has contributed to the grant, you may be asked to provide a letter of thanks that we can send to the donor right away. Certainly once your project is completed, we try to ensure that your report makes its way back to the donor, but it's always nice to be able to acknowledge their support kind of in the moment. We do all of our grant payments by automatic direct deposit. And so if we don't have that information on file, we'll of course follow up with you to gather that information. We encourage you to stay in touch with us. And so we know things happen. Sometimes your project might not unfold in the way that you anticipated. And so we just always appreciate you letting us know if there's going to be changes to your project. Again, we completely understand that sometimes things happen. We just really appreciate knowing kind of in advance as opposed to after the project has been completed. And then, of course, we do request a final report, which is due after your project is completed. Our guidelines state that organizations have up to 2 years after a grant is approved to complete the project and report, but that I wouldn't wait the full 2 years to submit your final report. The guideline is we'd ask that you submit your final report within 3 months of project completion, just to make sure that information is provided while it's still fresh. If unfortunately you're not successful with your grant application to the Winnipeg Foundation, you can always follow up with a member of our grants team to get feedback on your application, and we're always happy to provide that. And this is where we end. I feel like I've gone through a lot of information today, but I'm definitely happy to answer any questions that you might have. And maybe I will turn it over to my colleagues who are going to be reading some of the questions out in the chat. Oh, Mercy, I can't hear you.
Yes, I am on mute.
Okay.
Thank you. There's a couple questions around schools and if schools are eligible for grants. So I'm just wondering if you can clarify if projects within schools are eligible to apply for grants.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So for school projects, absolutely schools are eligible. If you are a public school that's part of a school division, you will apply through the profile attributed to your school division. Our guidelines state that we don't typically fund like in-class activities. It would be rare that we would fund extracurricular activities. However, the types of projects that we often support at school can include things like school greening projects, especially when improvements to the playground will benefit both the school community and the broader community, kids using the play area after hours. So school greening projects, as well as some play structures. In particular, if you're making a play structure more accessible to children of differing abilities. So that's some examples of the types of projects that would be eligible. I did highlight off the top, Carrie Ryan is our grants associate whose portfolio includes education. So if you want to follow up with her, if you've got more questions, Carrie would be a great resource for you.
Megan, I have a question here asking about resubmitting to the same program if you've been declined. Can an organization apply again in the next round in the same year?
Yeah, so that's we had that question at our last info session. And so yes, if you weren't successful receiving funding, that you could reapply. If that's your organization's circumstance, I would really encourage you to follow up with a member of our grants team to ensure that you've gotten the appropriate feedback on your initial application to ensure that your new application has a higher chance of success. I guess the one caveat to that, if the feedback was simply that your project was not eligible for funding from the Winnipeg Foundation, then no, you wouldn't resubmit in the fall intake.
If an organization has a fall 2020 projects that is still running right now, and the project is running until the end of the year, but they are intending to apply for this fall's grants intake, are they eligible?
Yeah, so really to be eligible for a new community grant, your previous grant needs to be wrapped up and reported on. There is a bit of opportunity if you're applying for the same program or project again. Would encourage you to follow up with your grants associate who was assigned to that file to talk about next steps and what that might look like for you.
Megan, someone was asking about notification date for applications that come in this round. It might be helpful for others just to reiterate the timeline.
Yeah, so for applications that are submitted October 3rd, we'll be meeting with our grants committee either at the very end of January or beginning of February. So you could expect notifications about the decisions on those applications no later than mid-February.
For collaboration projects, is the primary applicant the registered charity or the nonprofit organization?
Yes, so the primary applicant would need to be the charitable organization. Ultimately, our relationship would be with the charity that submits the application, but certainly the nonprofit partner could contribute information to the application as well.
Megan, there's a question here about someone noted that you could apply to the one-time community grant as well as the camp and summer program grant. They're asking, how does this differ from the camp and summer program grant? Sorry, how does the one-time community grant differ from the Camp and Summer Programs grant?
Oh, yeah. So Camp and Summer Program Grants has very specific parameters. So that's specifically for youth serving organizations to be able to provide fun summer activities to young people who may face barriers to making the most out of summer. And so those barriers might include financial barriers or physical barriers for young people who live with a disease or a disability. So it's very focused. The one-time community grants is a lot broader, and so we would accept applications for year-round programming for a full range of youth programs for children and youth. So the short answer is the Camp and Summer Program Grant is very narrow and specific in terms of the types of eligible projects.
Harry, you can go ahead.
I just have one very specific question here, which I will respond to, but that's all for general questions that I have.
Okay, maybe we'll.
One more, just actually a couple around projects that are based outside of the city. Can you maybe explain a little bit about projects involving activities outside Winnipeg, and how can staff demonstrate the eligibility for those grants?
Yeah, so for projects based outside of the city, it's helpful to have as specific statistics as possible. So again, I used the example of summer camps. So you might have, a summer camp located on the shores of Lake Winnipeg. In that example, it's really helpful for us to know what proportion of the campers that you serve come from Winnipeg. For projects that are provincial in scope, certainly we recognize that the majority of Manitobans live in Winnipeg, and so we'd be open to province-wide initiatives. So it's really about the number of folks from Winnipeg who will be served by your project is the best indicator in terms of that benefit to the citizens of Winnipeg. In recent years, other examples of projects that we've supported outside of the city, for example, we have supported women's emergency shelters located outside of Winnipeg, and they were able to make a particular case about sometimes it's not safe for Winnipeg for women to be in a shelter in the city, and so they're able to make that case of the benefit to Winnipeg as it's a safe place for women. Other examples, actually those are probably the three best examples: camps, province-wide initiatives, and particular circumstances where an organization's location actually allows them to best serve Winnipeggers.
If notification at the end of February and a project starts in October, so this October, any cost eligible to be applied to the grant once that's awarded in February?
So yeah, again, just to reiterate, the Winnipeg Foundation does not fund retroactively. So we would not consider any costs incurred prior to the grants committee decision. And again, for those applications being submitted October 3rd, our grants committee will be meeting at the very end of January or right at the beginning of February. So we would not consider any costs incurred from October through to the end of January.
I have a question here. I'm not sure if I'm capturing this right. If I'm not, I hope the poster will correct me. But they're asking about staffing costs for an ongoing project and whether those would be eligible.
Yeah, so that's probably a little bit depends on the circumstances of that project. I can say just generally, staffing costs are an eligible expense. We know that sometimes programs might be incurring additional staffing costs due to, well, certainly we know that during the pandemic, organizations had to accommodate more for staff being away due to illness. And so sometimes organizations are seeing increased staffing costs for that reason. There could be other reasons. So it does depend a little bit on your organization's circumstances. But yeah, if the person's looking for additional clarity, either you can post more in the chat or follow up with us directly to describe your to discuss your organization's specific circumstances.
Those are all the questions I have.
There's a question here around demonstrating approval of a organization board in terms of support for the project. So the questioner is wondering if that approval needs to be approval for submitting an application to the Winnipeg Foundation or a specific approval of the project.
Yeah, so certainly we would want to be sure that a board of directors was supportive of the project generally. Ideally, that your board would be informed of all the applications that you're submitting to support that project. But probably board approval of the project itself is more important than specific approval of the application to the Winnipeg Foundation, although we do ask you to click that as part of the application process.
I've tried to answer a lot of questions in the chat, so if I've not captured your question, please maybe we'll give it about 30 seconds so people can just put questions again if we've not captured them properly.
Yeah, and maybe just while we're waiting for any last minute questions that folks might have while they've got us today, just to reiterate that we're always available. Often it's more efficient for you to reach out to us via email. As you can imagine, closer to an application due date, the volume of inquiries does pick up significantly. And so when we receive those inquiries via email, we can sort of respond to them in order, and we can also kind of triage those and make sure that they make it to the person who's best able to answer your questions. For example, I've already highlighted if you're a school and you've got particular questions, Carrie's the best person to speak with, but you might have technical questions about the grant application itself. So there's others who are best positioned to support you with the technical aspects of application. So again, email is really the best way to reach out to us, and it allows us to be most efficient in responding back at you. It's not on the screen, but our general email address is grants@WPGFDN. So it looks like an abbreviated Winnipeg Foundation.org. All right, while I was chattering, did anybody think of any more questions, Mercy?
Nothing from my end.
No? Anything on your end, Carrie?
No.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us this morning. I hope the information was helpful. Again, just to reiterate, if you logged on a bit late and want to catch the beginning of the presentation, it will be available on our website in the next few days. If there's colleagues that you also think would benefit from viewing the information, again, you can refer them to the website. And just a final note that if you do have additional questions, please always feel free to reach out to a member of the grants team, and we're always happy to help you with the application process. So have a good rest of your day, everybody. Enjoy the sunny September weather.